So hello everyone, thank you all for coming. For those who don't know me, I'm Adrian Marshall. I'm the facilitator of the Grassy Plains Network, and we're these days part of the Victorian National Parks Association. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge the terrible loss of country, I suppose, or loss of the grasslands that have occurred across the breadth of Victoria. I have only recently discovered the existence of the damp grasslands of the Victorian southern coastal plain, which is a whole lot of grasslands that were well, they're extant around Pakenham in the old Cooey-Rup swamp, and it was just in reading that I was reminded of the extent to which the First Nations people managed the landscape, and this swamp that was the greatest swamp in Victoria is now, just a tiny little thing, and the soil levels dropped 2 meters when it was drained due to compaction and drying out and so on. So the changes have been remarkable, and I'm yes, deeply apologetic that we managed to do that. Tonight we have Dr. Joshua Hodges. They are a fire and grassland ecologist. They spoke to us recently about or last year about the grasslands in Wimmera, about which they are writing a book in 3 parts to be published in good 19th century style, quite possibly. But Josh is a CFA Vegetation Management Officer in the Wimmera, and he is going to be telling us all things CFA. Which will be magnificent because I have a deep lack of understanding of that, as well as talking to us about some fire ecology and what we can do and what needs to change. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Joshua. You're probably free to interrupt him if you go, but otherwise put your questions in the chat, please, and we'll have our usual extended Q&A at the end. I'm also sorry, Joshua. I'm also instructed to tell you all that to please hang around afterwards for the Grassy Plains Network meeting, if you so like. You're all unofficial members, as it were, of the Grassy Plains Network just by turning up to these things. So please, once you're on the mailing list, you're part of us, and yes, that's it. So please stay for the meeting. Thank you, and thank you, Joshua.
Thanks, Adrian, and I'll just confirm you can see my screen and it's all showing up perfectly. Excellent, lovely. I love it when the technology works. Thanks, Adrian, for the welcome, and thanks everyone for having me again. Great to give a second talk to the group, and I should issue an apology while things are being recorded that I did miss my last scheduled appointment. Unfortunately, the fire season in the western half of the state was quite intense this year, as people may have seen in the media, and still ongoing. So we had a significant fire in the patch on Sunday. So it's drying the landscape and we're still getting fires. But we're going to talk a bit about CFA, a bit about grasslands and a bit about fire. I wasn't sure about sort of knowledge levels of the organisation and ecology, so I've sort of thrown a bit of a mixed bag together tonight, and hopefully we'll move through it reasonably quickly, and there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end, and we can sort of discuss different aspects of the organisation and what we do and what we don't do, and why we do things is probably the more important one. So Adrian introduced me, but I'll quickly run through. Yes, Josh Hodges, PhD in grasslands and grassy woodland fire ecology. I'm very pleased to see Ken Barron on. I worked out of Canberra. Well, I was based in Albury at Charles Sturt, but I did mostly work out of the National Seed Bank in Canberra while I was studying, and have many fond memories of the grasslands up there. VMO in Horsham. I'll explain what a VMO is as we go through. I'm also a volunteer. I'm the second lieutenant at Narrabri Fire Brigade. I'm a volunteer member of the Plan Burn Task Force, which I'll talk a bit about as well, and I'm the Horsham District Land Care President. All right, so the CFA, what are we? What do we do? So the CFA is a volunteer-based firefighting agency that undertakes activities to mitigate, respond to, and assist recovery from bushfire in the country area of Victoria. We're one of 3 firefighting agencies in the state of Victoria, others being Fire Rescue Victoria, which look after the metropolitan area, and Forest Fire Management Victoria, which manages fire on public land. We, as an organisation, our activities are many and varied. We fight grass fires and bushfires. We fight house fires. We undertake road crash rescue. I'm a member at Nadamuck and Narrabri, and we spend a lot of time rescuing people off Mount Arapiles. So that's another activity that we do. Fuel load management is a part of that. Vegetation management is a better term than fuel load management, I think, but planned burning is obviously a part of that, which we'll talk about. We manage hazardous materials incidents, and we do community engagement. So we're many and varied, and that is really only part of it. We can go into a lot of detail around land use planning and all the various things that CFA gets involved in, research. There's many different things that we do. And we're led by a chief officer and a CEO, and I'll talk a bit about the structure of the organisation as we go through. So CFA is statewide. We have a state headquarters in Burwood East and 5 regions across Victoria. That's an important one when you're dealing with CFA Veg Management Officers, to understand that we're mostly structured in regions. And we do things slightly different in different regions. So I will kind of point out as I'm going through that some of the stuff that I'm talking about is a little bit specific to CFA West region, which is where I'm based. And within those, there are 21 fire districts. I'm based, as you can probably see on the map, in District 17 in Horsham. I also look after part of District 16, which is Ararat. And around those areas, I don't look after Ararat itself, but I look after areas in that district. The organisation is made up of 1,211 brigades. That includes forest industry brigades and Coast Guard. We're made up of 51,782 volunteers and 997 staff. So we're a big beast. We've got a lot of people, and we do a lot. So it's a very many and varied organisation. I mean, my role is mostly in the bushfire mitigation space. So not only do we respond to emergencies, but we play a critical role in helping to mitigate the effects of bushfires on community. And this includes vegetation management activities such as burning. Obviously, the roadside burning, which is probably going to be the meat and drink of this talk, is a big part of that. It also involves mechanical treatments, less and less as time goes on. Biological treatments such as grazing, not really in my part of the world, maybe elsewhere, I think up in northeast region, and a bit of landscaping around promoting defensible space. Green fire breaks, which I'll talk a little bit about, which is becoming hopefully a more and more important part about the way we manage fire risk. So that's a many and varied activity, but we'll mostly talk through the planned burning side of things. So CFA brigades undertake planned burns on behalf of a land manager to reduce fire risk. And these burns also benefit native grasslands, which I'm going to talk through in some detail. In terms of the why we do this and how we do this, it's conducted in accordance with Section 42 of the CFA Act, which authorises CFA to undertake burning at the request of and with the consent of the land manager. And that's an important point. CFA does not manage land. We do not have responsibility for the management of land. We do this on behalf of the land managers and owners. So it's really important from a grasslands point of view to be making sure that we're talking to the local landholders and we have their consent to undertake this kind of work. This is I'm not going to read all that because that's a very legalistic type thing that's taken straight out of the Act itself, but it's worth noting that within the Act and the way that we're authorising environment that we do plan burnings within CFA, a lot of this comes down to the officer in charge of the brigade. And from a grasslands advocacy point of view and trying to get more and more roadside burns done, it's really important to understand that who those people are in the community and make friends with them, and don't cheese them off, because they're a big part of the reason that we can get burns done, and they have a lot of authority to help us get that done. In terms of the structure, so we're structured in brigades, and then the groups of brigades are formed together. So in terms of trying to understand where we can get roadside burns done and who in terms of the volunteers we need to work with, that includes group officers and deputy group officers and captains who are in charge of brigades, and lieutenants who are kind of 2 and 3 and 4 ICs of brigades, and they have a lot of authority and pull under the Act. So the CFA Act and everything that we do vests authority in the CFA Chief Officer, which flows out to group and brigade officers as per Section 33 of the Act. And these are very important people to know if you want to get roadside burns done. So a big question that I do get from people is often around, like, how do we get more roadside burns done and how do I get my roadside burnt and stuff? A lot of this goes back to making good friends with these people in your community, because they're a big part of the reason that these get done, and also your local VMO. All right, so the Veg Management Program. So we are a subset within a subset within a subset of the organisation, but we are the staff members who coordinate and administer the planned burning program. So CFA employs us to support and coordinate planned burning and other veg management activities. This includes my role, which is the Vegetation Management Officer, the Vegetation Management Coordinators, which are my manager and above. So they sit at a much higher level and coordinate what we're doing. Vegetation management support officers, which are the people you never want to cheese off because they're the one that organise our lunches and dinners. So you don't want to be stuck with a bad dinner at a burn or a lunch. So you keep them happy as much as you can. Biodiversity and cultural heritage advisors and commanders plan burning in various roles within the organisation. So in terms of probably the faces of it and the ones that you see kind of working on the ground, it's predominantly the VMOs. Look, our role is not just burning, and it's worth saying that because I think sometimes from an outside perspective, sometimes it gets a bit confusing as to why burning is not always everything that we do are always our 100% focus. Organising roadside burning is only a part of the VMO's role. In CFA West Region, we did some work last year in trying to understand why we exist. And CFA Veg Management, I should say, exists within the broader community safety department, which is made up of vegetation management, land use planning, and community engagement. And our role really is to empower CFA members, communities, and land managers to prepare for fire. From a VMO, veg management point of view, that involves planning and coordinating delivery of the CFA portion of the Joint Fuel Management Program, which I'll talk a little bit about, and the municipal fire management subplans, supporting brigades to deal with incidental fuel management issues. A reasonable part of my job is, occasionally someone will contact me about a block that's been abandoned on the edge of town, and we need to work with the councils to get that fuel managed and stuff. So that does take up a bit of time. And supporting CFA members, land managers, and landholders with technical advice on strategic planning and delivery of fuel management works, including asset and township protection, landscape strategic fuel breaks, and individual property and structure preparation. That's a very long-winded sentence, but basically what that means is I exist to give advice to people on best ways to undertake to reduce risk to themselves and their property. And stakeholder and community engagement regarding fuel management, which is becoming a bigger and bigger job. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but we are under increased scrutiny for all the burning that we do, and getting out there and explaining to communities why we do that is becoming a bigger and bigger part of the role. But I like a good meme, and I think this basically explains the role of the VMO. My role is basically to rally the troops and get them to charge. And that involves working with the brigades and kind of getting them organised to burn and looking out for weather windows and hopefully rallying the troops and getting everything organised. Some of you will be aware that we are hopefully doing that this weekend in Warndoo, and it's a big job. That kind of week into a burn is very, very full on in terms of getting everything organised, and that includes, getting members there to do the burn, organising the trucks, the catering, the traffic management, organising the approvals process, talking with the operations team and all that sort of stuff, handing out notification flyers, working with the land managers to let them know that we're doing what we're doing, making sure that what we're not going to be doing is impacting any community events and all that sort of stuff. So continually monitoring weather to make sure that we're within prescription and that we're not doing it on a day that is not going to be conducive to burning. So it's a big, big week in the lead up. So, and it's a big job. It's also worth noting too that CFA Veg Management staff undertake incident management support roles during fires, floods, and other emergencies. And this is a really significant time commitment over the high-risk weather season. I think this year I left my Veg Management Officer duties in maybe November after a few stints in October, and I returned in April. So there's several months where I was engaged in the bushfire response, which does take away time from the Veg Management Officer's role. So occasionally, I sort of get into April and I start getting a lot of inquiries from people as to why haven't we started burning yet? And it's because I've just spent multiple months and I'm very fatigued from fire season, and VMOs get that a bit. So we kind of go from burn season to fire season to burn season, and it is a big role. And we undertake varied roles: incident controller, information and warnings officer, those alerts you get on the Vic Emergency app, and fire behaviour analyst, which is my role. All right, so let's get into the meat and drink as to how we actually do this. So again, every region will do this slightly different. In CFA West region, all of our CFA works are included on the Municipal Fire Management Plan works list. So that's a document that exists. Basically at a council level, it gets reviewed every few years, and all of the CFA works that are authorised and approved by the Municipal Emergency Management Planning Committees, it sits on that list. And then any of those planned to be conducted in the next 3 years are nominated onto the Joint Fuel Management Program, which includes both DECA's planned burning that they do on the public land estate and our burns. And that's the way we do it. We review the JFMP annually, and we maintain that list. So if you want an idea of what we're planning to do, getting yourself access to the JFMP and the mapping that gets put up every year is a good idea. I won't go through all of this, but the process for getting burns organised and planned is many and varied, and can be reasonably complicated, but it has to go through a reasonably vigorous assessment process. Has to be assessed by a VMO, has to go through approvals locally. So it goes from our local district chief fire officer, sorry, I should take a step back, goes through the captain, the groups, assistant chief fire officers, up to deputy chief officers, and then all the way to the chief fire officer. So the chief officer and the chief fire officer for DECA. So it goes through a many approvals process, many stepped approval process. And also goes through biodiversity and cultural heritage checks to make sure that we're compliant with legislation. And there's many things involved with that. Predominantly in the biodiversity space, it usually involves excluding threatened species, or can also include restrictions on when we do burn. So we tend to not burn high quality grasslands in spring. And also could be the way that we construct our control lines. So we tend to have a control line on all of our burns. So, the way that we do that is can impact species. So there's many and various things in that. And in a heritage space, it's usually protection of cultural heritage trees like scar trees or scatter sites and various things that can pop up on roadsides and within our treatments. And then eventually we get to writing burn plans and hopefully eventually convincing the brigades to come on board to do these burns. And then, oops, sorry, just jumping ahead there. And then even once we've got to the burn plan stage and the approve, and we're there and we've got all our volunteers and we're ready to do a burn, and maybe we've got the planned burn task force involved, there is an approval process for igniting a burn. So there's actually a multi-stepped approvals process through the district duty officers and things to actually have an ignition authorised. And there's various permit requirements on that as well. So, and that depends on whether we're within the fire danger period or not. So we do require Schedule 12 permits for burning off during the fire danger period. And also, traffic management and potentially FFG permits. I haven't had to do any burns with FFG permits, but it could happen. All right, so this is sometimes a key question that I get from people who aren't always familiar with CFA or understand necessarily the rhyme and reason as to why we do burns. So we have strategic priorities, and that's the way that we work through prioritising when and where and why we're going to do our burns. Our number one priority is the protection of life. That is a government directed. It's written within the State Emergency Management Plan. That is our primary focus at all times. Protection of townships and assets, creating landscape strategic fuel breaks of sufficient width and continuity to halt or slow the spread of a fire. Using fire to maintain and promote fire responsive species and ecosystems. Obviously, grasslands are a key part of this, and I'm going to go into the ecology of that in a few moments. Enabling cultural fire. We do cultural burning with the registered Aboriginal parties and traditional owner groups around the state, which is increasingly a big part of our business and an important part. Facilitating training and professional development. So planned burning is a really key training tool for volunteers going out onto the fire line. All right, so I'm just going to go through this a little bit about how we actually approach this. So the research shows that there's 3 major causes of death during bushfires, and I apologise if I understand this can be a sensitive topic sometimes discussing our way through this. Obviously, that includes reducing risks to people at higher risk, age, illness, mobility, disability. So reducing risk in the interface with hospitals and aged care facilities and things like that. Obviously, evacuating aged care facilities during bushfire is a very significant undertaking. Creating areas where people can pull over and shelter during a fire. So, for example, one of the big risks with fires is people getting trapped on roadsides and getting burnt over by fire, which can obviously cause them significant harm. So a big part of what we do is actually trying to reduce fuel loads on major access roads or major commuter roads. So major highways and things, actually to reduce the fire risk to people travelling up and down the road. So this is a big part of our role. Where I am in the Wimmera, this predominantly expresses itself through burning in the interface with neighbourhood safer places. So some of you will be aware that I shouldn't say most, some towns have neighbourhood safer places in them which are areas where people can go to shelter during a bushfire, and we take burns and stuff around those just to reduce the risk to them. All right. So, wow. And what does that mean? And how do we actually protect townships and assets? So, research shows that fuel management is most effective at reducing house infrastructure structure loss, should include life loss in that, when done within the wildland urban interface. So, within the interface of assets. And there's a bit of science behind this. Effectively, there are 3 ways that houses get destroyed during a bushfire. One of it is from radiant heat from the fire, ember attack, and direct flame contact. And basically what we're trying to do with our planned burning and our fuel management activities is to reduce the amount of radiant heat, reduce the intensity of a fire coming into contact with the structure, and reduce the amount of ember attack. Look, I'm a grass fire person, so I'm mostly going to put this in the context of a grass fire, but how does burning actually achieve that goal? So that sort of top scenario there is a scenario of a fire moving through an unmanaged grassland, and that is typically has increased fire intensity and flame heights due to increased biomass. You could read fuel there if you like. More radiant heat impacting structures, assets, and people, harder to suppress. And obviously I put a house there, but you could very easily replace that with a shed or a fence or a car or a person. And that's not going to have particularly great outcomes if you're getting exposed to that kind of fire intensity. What plan burning does, it reduces the fuel and probably more importantly, to some extent, breaks up the continuity of the grass tussocks and reduces the radiant heat and fire intensity. That means less impacts to a structure, making it more likely to survive, and also makes it easier to suppress. So suppressing intense grass fires can be very, very difficult. Having a much lower intensity fire makes it a lot easier for people like myself and other volunteers to get in there and put them out. So landscape strategic fuel breaks. So this is probably not as much of a focus in the Wimmera where I am, but down on the southwest and the Victorian volcanic plains, the really big roadside burning that gets done down there. This is the theory behind it. So we do conduct burn to create landscape strategic fuel breaks, predominantly using the road and rail network. We tend to focus on 3 and 5 chain roads, so 60 to 100 metre wide roads to create really significant breaks in the landscape. And the idea being is that those should be of sufficient width and continuity to slow or halt the spread of a fire as it starts. And how does that actually do that? Well, burning limits spread as discontinuous grasslands only burn under higher wind speeds due to a lack of connected fuel to carry a fire. So if you imagine a fire moving through the landscape and it's consuming fuel as it goes and it's interacting with the fuels, what a burn does is it effectively knocks out accumulated litter, and then you have individual tussocks that have grown that year. And if the flame isn't big enough to connect those individual tussocks, it can actually limit the spread. And I'm going to show you some photos of examples of what that actually looks like, because it's a bit hard to sort of imagine it using a diagram. And if if the fire intensity is low enough, it can actually hit the road, and because obviously a road is bare of fuel, it can actually hit the road and stop spreading. Not always the case, but it can. And also noting that some are growing native grasses, so Themata, which is very common native grass on the Victorian volcanic plain, where you guys are mostly focused on, are also greener over fire season and can act as a green break. So that goes back to that green break stuff that CFA is focused on. So they're a really effective tool for managing fire spread, because usually if they're spreading through dry crop, they're moving at a fair rate of spread and a very high intensity, which is hard to suppress. They hit that green break and the intensity can drop, and that can make it a strategic place to put it out. And that's effectively that diagram there. So, even if the winds are strong enough, so you kind of imagine a discontinuous grassland, there's not a lot of wind, so it's limiting the spread. But even if you've got strong winds, the intensity, and it is spreading through those tussocks, so the fire is big enough to connect the tussocks up and it's still spreading, the intensity of that is going to be considerably lower. So that makes these sort of wide roadside areas strategic areas to suppress fires. Using either tankers, so you can imagine a CFA truck going down the road and it moving out onto the roadside and them knocking it down with their hose, or even aircraft. So increasingly, aircraft play a very big role in putting out fires. They tend to be on scene faster than fire trucks as a result of predetermined dispatch, which is when the fire behaviour indices or fire danger indices reach a certain level, they're automatically dispatched to fires. And you can imagine sort of a fire moving to that area and an aircraft kind of knocking it down as it reaches the roadside. So These are really, really strategic areas in the landscape. You can imagine, I'm sort of trying to imagine a fire like the Moyston fire, which was spreading through the landscape at a fair rate of knots, or the Murra fire or the Pinery fire, which some of you may have been aware, like trying to stop that when it's spreading at very, very high intensities, or through crop, for example, through unharvested crop. You finding those strategic areas where you can actually kind of anchor it and make a stand is pretty important. So that's why doing these roadside burns is very important. And also, if you can as I said before, if you can knock the fire intensity out of it enough, it may actually hit the road and stop spreading. It might not jump the road. So it reduces the likelihood of the fire breaching the road and continuing to spread. So, diagrams are great, but it's hard to sort of imagine that. So this is a burn that was conducted, and I'm not sure whether there's any Planned Burn Task Force members on, but some of them may have been at this burn. This was a burn we did in Vectis a couple of weeks ago, probably about a month or so now. And the Remler Road sort of runs west out of Horsham, and there was a section that got burnt 12 months ago by the local brigade. And there was another section that they didn't quite get to, and that hadn't been burnt for a number of years. So this year we burnt, or attempted to burn the entire thing. And you can see on the right, so that's the section that hadn't been burnt for more than 5 years. And you can there was very little wind on this day. This was a really mild day to do a burn, and it spread through those fuels very easily. And you can see 100%, effectively 100% burn coverage there. Whereas on the left, that's the section that got burnt 12 months ago, and we really just couldn't get it to burn. It wouldn't actually spread, and you can kind of see maybe in the photo a lot of bare ground sort of showing through there. So that gives you a visual of like why those tussocks weren't connected, and there wasn't enough wind to bridge the gap between them, so the fire wouldn't spread. It kind of got through a few little bits in areas where it could, but other than that, we just could not get it to spread. So that's a good visual kind of idea of what I'm talking about. But you can imagine, like these grasses are not particularly tall, and the fuel loads in there are not particularly high. So you can imagine even on a windy day, if a fire, say, jumped out of that paddock and got into here, yes, it would spread through this, but the fire intensity would not be particularly high. So you can imagine a tanker, that's sort of Horsham off there in the distance. You can imagine a tanker kind of coming down here and putting it out with its hose, or an aircraft coming out of Horsham Airport and starting to knock it down, hopefully pretty quickly. So that's a pretty good, well, hopefully that's a pretty good visual idea of what I'm talking about. All right, so does this work? Yes, but I'm going to give you some monitoring to show you that. So this is some monitoring of my joint fuel management program from 2023 to 2024. CFA has devised a monitoring program for basically monitoring its burns. I don't do it for every burn. I will admit to you, I don't have the time necessarily to do that, but I do try to do that for as many grassland burns in particular that I can. And you can see on the left, so this is bare ground cover. So pre-treatment, we were sort of looking at 0 to 20% bare ground cover across the treatments. And then immediately post-treatment, we're up 90%. So you can sort of imagine that after that ash clears, you've got quite a bit of bare ground under there. And then as time goes on, you sort of get more and more vegetation coming back and less bare ground. But this is still fairly discontinuous even 12 months later. So we're still looking at 25% plus bare ground. So you can imagine that acting as a bit of a barrier to fire spread. And I'm going to talk about intertussock spaces and why that's important for a grassland ecology also. And on the right here, litter cover. So that's probably an individual grass tussock isn't in and of itself really that big of a fire risk. It's all the litter that builds up. So when a fire moves through that tussock, it spreads through the litter to the next tussock and next tussock and keeps spreading. So that's why litter cover is rather important. You can see the litter cover in a lot of these grasslands. So when I came out here, a lot of the grasslands hadn't been burnt for quite some time, and the litter cover was exceptionally high. Mostly C3 dominated grasslands, so retardosperma, so not like Themata, which is a bigger plant. And then we sort of haven't had that litter reaccumulate even in 12 months. So that's not as present in the grassland. And I'll talk a little bit about aridity gradients and how quickly some of this can reaccumulate. But out in the Wimmera, we've had an exceptionally dry couple of years, so that's not really accumulating at any great speed. Oh, I'm going to talk about the next slide. How good. Grasslands in Victoria exist across an aridity gradient. So aridity is a mixed measure of looking at precipitation and net radiation, so solar radiation. It's effectively a measure of how dry a place is. And this is a perennial question in CFA and fire management circles and ecological circles around how frequently do we need to burn to meet our fire management and ecological objectives. And this is likely to vary with aridity due to different grass accumulation rates. That's accumulating very slow. The Wimmera is a fairly dry part of the world, as people would be aware. People probably are aware too that on the Victorian volcanic plain and other places which are quite productive, the grasses tend to accumulate a lot quicker. So burning more frequently is probably important. But this is something that we're trying to do just to understand both effectively two things. One is tolerable fire intervals. So looking at that from an ecological point of view, how frequently do we need to burn, or how long can we leave a roadside before we start to see ecological decline? That's likely to vary depending on aridity, and also optimal return intervals for fire purposes. So how frequently do I need to get out there and burn a road for it to maintain it as an effective fuel break? So keeping in mind that one there, we burnt 12 months ago, and that's still acting as a very effective break. So we don't need to be out there every year burning that grass. All right, let's get into the fun ecology stuff. I think this is also very important to talk about. So, in terms of CFA burns, very few CFA burns get done purely for ecological reasons. It does happen, but all of our burns have an ecological outcome. And I think it's worth pausing there just to kind of reflect on that for a few seconds, because I think sometimes this does limit roadside burning in the roads that we do burn, is that we don't go out there and burn for ecological purposes. We're not a land management agency. We're not an environmental group. We're not ecologists. Well, I am, but for the vast majority aren't ecologists. But what we do is we go out there and burn predominantly for strategic fire risk purposes. So I think sometimes that probably creates a little bit of tension sometimes in some of these roadsides that really, really need to be burnt for ecological purposes, but they don't necessarily rank particularly high in our priority list from a fire risk point of view, and that does limit getting burns. And I don't always have control over that. A lot of these decisions get made at a much higher level than me. CFA burning over the years has played a pretty critical role in maintaining healthy native grassland and grassy woodlands. I bolded maintaining there. It's sort of it's almost a little bit of a pedantic point, but I do hear some people say fire increases biodiversity in native grasslands. Not so much the case. It's more about maintenance of diversity, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But well, I'll talk about that a bit more in a bit more detail as to what I'm talking about there. All right, so how does this actually happen? So why do CFA burns, why do we have such healthy native grassland where CFA burns? Well, in native grasslands, competition for light and space excludes species in the absences of disturbances such as fire due to the accumulation of litter from previous year's growth in intertussock spaces. So competition for, that wasn't a very well constructed sentence, I apologize. Busy fire season, busy burn season, and fires on the weekend. Some of these slides have been thrown together with a bit of haste. I apologise. But basically what we're talking about here is competition for light and space is a really, really important factor in a species occurrence in native grasslands. And in the absence of fire, you get a build-up of grass growth and litter, which then excludes some species. So what fire does do is it reduces competition and creates some space for some of these forbs and wildflowers and smaller grass species to co-occur and establish and flower. So on the left, you've got your closed habitat, increased competition for resources, such as light, space, and nutrients, and periodic fire reduces that competition, allowing more species to coexist. And it's worth pausing there just to make some connections between the interactions between ecology and fire risk, because I think that's important. What we're getting here is healthy native grassland and grassy woodlands. We're getting reduced biomass, which makes fires easier to suppress and reduces the chances of it jumping a road. And we get discontinuity, which limits spread unless wind speeds are elevated. So we're sort of ticking multiple boxes here: ecology, fire risk. So I think that's an important note, is that there is a really happy marriage here between fire management and biodiversity, which is great. What are the many and varied ways that species come back from fire? It's worth noting that in native grasslands are predominantly a perennial dominated ecosystem, so predominantly plants will resprout from the bud and tuber bank. They do also germinate in response to smoke and heat cues. In fact, that was the topic of my PhD thesis, which I'm going to present some results on in a few moments. Increased post-fire flowering, and I do apologise, I do present this talk occasionally in a bit more of a general sense, so I did include thermal insulation and above ground persistence, which is not really a thing in native grasslands, but it does occur in other species. So how does too infrequent fire threaten grassland? So it's sort of in that top left-ish there, you're sort of seeing a healthy grassland in its native state. You're seeing the above ground flora looking very happy. You're also seeing the below ground flora. So those buds and tubers and some seeds, that's what those black dots are, sitting below ground ready to regenerate. In the absence of fire, you get that increased biomass accumulation in the intertarsic spaces, and it's starting to reduce increased competition for light and space, and you're starting to see those species disappear. But we still have from the above ground flora, I should say. But we still have buds and tubers and seeds in below ground. So there's still capacity for this grassland to come back, and we're seeing that a little bit where you burn a grassland. I'm sorry, I should say we're seeing that more so in the Wimmera, where we're burning grasslands which haven't had fire for quite a long time, and we're actually seeing quite good regeneration of wildflowers, and I'll show you a couple of examples of those in a few moments. So there obviously still some sort of regenerative capability sitting there. However, I suppose if you go long enough, eventually those buds and tumors die. They're either aged or lost to predation. Same with seeds. The timelines around that, there's probably people on this call who would know better than me. In seeds, it's quite short times. Most native grasslands have a transient seed bank, so seeds tend to age quickly and be lost, or age and or be lost to predation quite quickly. In terms of buds and tubers and rhizomes and various things that things resprout from, your guess is as good as mine as to how long some of these species will last for. I don't know, to be honest. I'm really hoping John Morgan is on this call and he will tell us at the end, but I'm afraid I don't really know. But eventually you start to lose that, and also noting that weeds will be taking over and things in that time as well. You're all thinking to yourselves, well, even if they're lost, why don't they just disperse back in from a nearby grassland? Well, most of these grassland remnants are found on roadsides and rail corridors, which are surrounded by paddocks made up of crops or pasture grasses and various things. So they're heavily fragmented. So the ability for species to disperse back in is quite limited. And then you're at the point of having to do active restoration and direct seeding to actually restore that grassland. So it's in our best interest to try and keep grasslands in this state as much as we can to keep them healthy. That's why it's about maintenance of diversity. And if they get to this, then we need to get a fire back into them pretty soon to stop it from becoming that. And then there's plenty of roads in this state now, which is very sad. Right. Let's talk about some good stuff. So some happy stories. So this is those of you who came to my Wimmera Plains Grassland talk will have heard about Dutch and Bargara Lake Road. At that time, we were still working towards cool burning trials in there. We've now done a number of cool burning trials in that grassland. And so I'm a big fan of these diagrams, but I think photos tell the better story. So on the left here, hopefully you can see that concept that I was talking about individual tussocks and that litter all built up in the intertussock spaces, which is limiting that, increase that competition for light and space, and a lot of space there for things to establish and flower. It's increased competition for light. That's a photo of, we've actually done 3 burns now in that grassland. That's a photo of one of the burns. As you notice, it was a very cool burn. I think I did it in, I want to say August. Actually, I think this one might have been July. We did one in June, one in July, and one in August. It was very dry last year, so we were only just starting to get a bit of green stuff coming up. Winter growing grasses predominantly, so rotidospermas and stipers rather than kangaroo grass. And this is the result afterwards. So you can see that photo on the left, that was pretty representative of the grassland as a whole. And then afterwards, we had quite a number of wildflowers that came up. That's Lomandra filiformis, Vididinia, and that's grey germander. So a number of native wildflowers coming up. So you can kind of imagine to some extent that it was probably more so in this second state here. So there was still capacity for these species to come back. They weren't fully gone, and now we've burnt it, and we've actually got an increase in diversity of wildflowers. So that's a really positive outcome. I can tell you're all thinking to yourselves, but CFA doesn't just do cool burns. In fact, it's a minority of the stuff that we do in many respects, but that isn't necessarily limited to our cool burning. We do quite a lot of reasonably higher intensity roadside burns. This particular example is Naring grassland, which some of you may know. It's up north of Shepparton. It's quite close to Numurkah, where I was born. And this is a grassland that got burnt last year. This is a photo. This photo was actually from a couple of years before we did the burn in 2021 when I was out there surveying it for my PhD. But this was in spring, so you can see very, very little species coming up there. That's getting well and truly choked out it was a wetter year as well. So I apologize. This is 2021 when we first planned to burn it, not when I was surveying it for my PhD. That was in 2018. In 2021, it was a fairly wet year, so we had quite a bit of growth on it, and you can see not very many wildflowers coming up in there, and imagining increased competition as previously mentioned. And you can see that we've burnt that. Last year, it was a reasonably higher intensity fire just because it was so dry last year. We actually burnt that reasonably late in the season, and I was the ignition crew leader on that job, and there wasn't much I could do to keep that thing from not burning at reasonably high intensity because it was so dry. And that's a photo from Doug Robinson from Trust for Nature. I think he took that photo potentially in September. And you can see there, like, you kind of compare the left to right. So you can see really, really choked up. You can see all the bare ground there. And the increased intertussock spaces and quite an increase in wildflower diversity and flowering, probably more so flowering output than anything else. Noting that this was a crazy dry year. So we probably, if we had a bit more moisture, it might have been even more impressive. But you start to put that in terms of ecology and grasslands, it's looking very nice, but you start to think about that in terms of fire risk as well. So you can very, very quickly imagine it a bit drier than that, but you can very, very quickly imagine a fire moving through that, such as the one that we lit, very, very easily. But you can see, like, I can't really see a fire moving through there at a great rate of knots with that much bare ground sitting there. So that's kind of those concepts coming together, hopefully, through some photographs. It's worth noting too that even just maintaining healthy native grassland reduces risk. This is a topic that comes up very frequently in CFA circles around, why do we burn in autumn? Why don't we burn in spring closer to fire season so that we've got black ground when fire season goes through? It's a very, very, very common debate that we have with both paid staff and volunteers. And it's worth noting that, even just maintenance of native grassland reduces our risk. It creates those green breaks, as I mentioned. But you start to put that in terms of suppressibility, in terms of knocking down a fire as it spreads. This is fire intensity here on the right. You can see in terms of kilojoules per meter, native grasslands quite a lot lower than the exotic grasslands. So you put that just purely in the terms of what a volunteer can expect when they rock up in a truck and they're trying to put the fire out. These fires are going to be much easier to put out than these fires because the intensity is lower. Okay, so that's, I think that hopefully that point speaks for itself to some extent. Fire, not necessarily interchangeable either, because your next question is, why don't we just mow these grasslands? And there is some studies that do look at mowing. Well, not this one, but there are others, but the article on the left was a literature review that I was involved in as a PhD student with my PhD supervisor Jody and John Morgan and others, and an honours student Michael Cleland, and we conducted a literature review to look at basically switches in disturbance types. And we looked at southeastern Australia generally, but what prompted the question was mostly looking at areas where that had been grazed historically, and then we were switching them over to fire, but we weren't seeing any increase in biodiversity. Remember, fire doesn't increase biodiversity. Remember that. And we were wondering why. Like, why aren't we seeing this? Largely that goes back to this concept back here where they had been grazed and not burnt for so long that I suspect they were probably more in this state, so they needed to be actively restored to get back to some sort of native state. Which that paper did bear out. The only papers where we saw increase in diversity was ones that just switches in disturbance type was coupled with seed addition. But the bigger story out of that paper too was that you can't really switch disturbance types from fire to another disturbance type. So go from fire to mowing or fire to grazing and necessarily maintain diversity. Effectively, that question was the topic of my PhD, and I spent 4 years looking into why that might be. My theory on it is that fire doesn't just remove biomass. Like, it's not just about competition. That's a key part of it. But there's also other things that fire provides. Some of that's about nutrients, but probably also to some extent it provides physiochemical conditions, which is a bit jargony, but it provides smoke and heat, which other disturbances don't, which then can also act as a cue for germination in combination with things like moisture and sunlight and things. The figure on the right is one of the sorry, what have I done there? The figure on the right is a figure from my PhD thesis, and I won't rob you of the hours of pleasure you'll have reading that. Please do. I think the examiners, myself and my mother, are the only ones that have read it in full. But it's well worth a look at that. This was 6 studies. So this experiment was done in Canberra at a number of grasslands sites that our friend from Canberra will hopefully be aware of. But basically what I did is I had 3 treatments: a control, which was just a grassland left on its own; removal, so I actually got down there with a quadrat and a pair of scissors and I cut all the biomass out, which was quite a fun exercise. I was a bit fitter then, actually, to be honest. So that was that one, and fire, so that we burnt it. And then actually before we burnt it and before we did the biomass removal, we sowed seed into each of those 1 meter quadrats. So we did lines and sowed each of the 6 species in the lines, 1 biomass removed, 1 burnt, and 1 controlled, and obviously replicated over multiple sites, and 10 quadrats per site. And that's the analysis from that experiment. And you can see, with the exception of bulbine bulbosa, which is a bit of a special case, and a little bit of Themata, the only real seed emergence that we got was out of the burn. And now, noting that this was a dry year, which to some extent maybe skews this result a little bit. Unfortunately, COVID kicked off not long after I did this experiment, which I was very disappointed in, but I wanted to do multiple years. But we did see some really good germination occurring pretty much of all 6 species in the burn, and quite a bit. Now, I only sowed 100 seeds of most of these species, and I got close to 100 germinating out of some of these. So there's a really good result. And I think that speaks to the hypothesis that I was putting forward as part of my PhD, which is that fire is providing something that biomass removal on its own doesn't. And my theory on that was it's the smoke and heat cues. That's combined with some laboratory germination trials that I did, where I looked at smoke and heat in a laboratory and saw increased germination. Whether there's other aspects at play, future PhD students and honours students can have a field day with that one, hopefully. But to sum up, that was a big journey. But to sum up on that, it's really important to realise that burning is not substitutable for mowing, and that's really important for the way that we manage native grasslands now. Increasingly, social license for planned burning is declining, and land managers are becoming less and less keen on issuing permits and consents for CFA brigades to do burns, and they're switching over their management to mowing, and that is a bit of a threat, and that's something that we should be aware of in the way that we approach native grassland conservation. All right, so what limits burning in the CFA? So we could have a long conversation about this, I reckon, and people have different views. This is just my view of the world as a long-term CFA volunteer and a CFA staff member who works with this all the time. I think the biggest one is sufficient available members to undertake burns. The Plan Burn Task Force is very much bridging the gap here. Without the Plan Burn Task Force, many of the roadsides that have been burnt in the last couple of years would not have been burnt. So they're making a really, really big difference. They are assisting with this, but they're still a finite resource. You remember, they're volunteers. We can't just keep flogging them forever and using them for burns. They are a finite resource. They do a fantastic job at getting this done, though. So that's really important to note that their contribution to this. And I'll talk a little bit about what I think members of this group could be doing in regards. Fatigue, both of staff and volunteers. I put that in there on a bit of a personal note. This fire season has knocked a lot of us around in terms of fatigue. It was very intense, and that's problem's only going to get worse with climate change, where we're not superhuman. We do get fatigued. I'm feeling it on a personal note, and many of the volunteers are feeling it as well, especially members of the Plan Burn Task Force. We've been using them a lot over both fire season and burn season, so at some point that does give. Community opposition to plan burning. Yes, that's becoming a bigger one. I'm not necessarily going to comment on some of the commentary around plan burning. Some of it I agree with, some of it I find very infactual. But without a doubt, that is impacting us in CFA. So I got called an ecocidal maniac on social media a couple of weeks ago talking about grassland burning. So we just need to be aware of that. And I think we need to be promoting that nuance around fire. Whatever your views on forestry burning and forest burning is, we really need to be out there promoting native grasslands and the way that fire plays a role in these ecosystems. Well, we could spend all night talking about that, but I think we'll leave that there. Consent and approvals from land managers. Vast majority of land managers in Victoria are very, very, very good. We do have some that are hesitant to provide consent to CFA for burning. That's part of my role, is working through that with them. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not, but we are hopefully turning the tide on that one. But that does sometimes limit burning. And 5 is, so-called red tape. In my opinion, that gets overused as an excuse for burns not happening. Undoubtedly, it has had an impact, but I get paid to work through that red tape. So there shouldn't be any red tape on CFA volunteers. That's why I exist. So I apologise if this offends anyone, but I do think that excuse gets overused. to stop burning from happening, or to explain why burning isn't happening. Availability of suitable weather windows, that's a yes and a no. And I think this is where we need to get a little bit adaptable to climate change. Climate change is changing the game a little bit on weather windows, and we need to have a think about what weather windows look like in the future. Um, I think last year in the Wimmera we burnt right through to, well, I don't think we really stopped. We burnt right through because it was so dry. I suspect we will be again this year, which only adds to the fatigue levels. But we need to be looking at more of that autumn winter burning rather than burning a little bit earlier when it's a bit drier. I think that's just my personal views on it. But I think climate change will increasingly see that happen, because that traditional sort of March, April weather window, I mean, it was dry as chips here in March and April. So if we want to limit fire intensity for various reasons, I think we need to start looking later into the season. What should be done? Increase CFA capacity to undertake burns through local engagement. A big part of my role, and I think I showed that meme earlier, is rallying the troops and getting the CFA brigades excited about this. In some respects, myself and the other veg management officers have been very, very successful in this, in getting the brigades on side. In some cases, we haven't been. There are still plenty of holdouts out there, and brigades that we struggled to get on board. That's just the nature of the many and varied organisation that we work for. And increasing the planned burn task force. Again, the planned burn task force is so key now. We just wouldn't be getting burns done without them. So, that's I think the key one. If a piece of advice I think for this group, if you are capable and willing, joining your nearest brigade and getting yourself on the planned burn task force is a great way to get yourself involved in this. I'd love to see that. I think the more people that we can get out helping us do burns would be great. And also, if you have views on how CFA does burns and you want to see change in that, that's another way to get in and maybe help the change there. Supporting Forest Fire Management Vic in completing grassland burns on public land. They're called Forest Fire Management Victoria. Maybe we need to, or Grasslands Fire Management Victoria, I don't know. That's a little joke. But, we do have quite a bit of grassland on public land, and, increasing that burning would be fantastic. They do a fantastic job already, don't get me wrong. But obviously encouraging that more would be good. And obviously this is something that this group can get involved in doing, hopefully a bit of advocacy on making sure that these burns are being done. Building capacity for private landholders and environmental groups to undertake burning. This is a topic very near and dear to my heart. I'm trying lots of different avenues to do this, but particularly with local land care groups at the moment, in trying to get them confident in doing cool burning. I'm just going to jump back a bit because I just want to show you this photo again. This kind of burn here is very, very low intensity and very, very minimal risk. This is the kind of burning that people could be doing with very minimal resources and hopefully a bit of training and a bit of confidence. So, you can see the ecological outcomes of this kind of burning there. So this is the kind of thing that I think we need to be doing more of. If we go back to the limiting factors, big limiting factor is having sufficient available members to actually do this. So, being able to look at those opportunities where we can do this with less resources and things would be really, really good. Where am I? And an ecological burning task force. I put a question mark there because that's something that maybe I think this group could talk about advocating for. I'm a CFA volunteer, CFA staff member. I'm very passionate about the role that volunteer fire brigades play in this. But a question I will pose to you, and I'm happy to say this while we're recording, is that a great system, relying on volunteer firefighters to maintain a critically endangered native ecosystem? Should we be promoting more of a paid force that's dedicated to doing this? Don't know. But I put this to the group. That's something that we should be advocating for. And that's it, Adrian. That was a very many and varied presentation, but I just thought I'd throw things out there and maybe stimulate some conversation. People can ask questions.
Fantastic, Joshua. That was very, very informative indeed. I'm interested. Well, obviously the ecological burning task force is a big one. Would the argument be that it would be taking resources away from protecting life and all those primary responsibilities that are in the Act and so
on? I think it would, Adrian, but I think that's where we've really got to sell the story that actually maintaining healthy native grassland is in of itself a method of reducing fire risk. Obviously, there's always going to be that high priority stuff closer to towns and areas of high life risk, but I would hope that, if we could get proper investment in this space, there would be enough money and time and stuff to be able to do this, to do all these things that people value. Unfortunately, that's not always the case at the minute. Government does invest quite well in fuel management and planned burning. We're not strapped for cash to some extent, but I think if we could sort of more work on this kind of space, I think that would be really good.
Louise Ashton, you have your hand up, I believe.
I don't think so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're taking it.
Oh, it was my cursor. Was it my cursor that it was left with a little hand? I'm sorry. Well, feel free to ask a question. But what have we got? We have Daniel Bennon asks it seems like quite a complicated question. So planned burns / land management of roadsides are made via Vic roads and councils as land managers on public land, understanding section 42 of the CFA. In understanding how there is, so that would require a broader localized community engagement plan. Do you?
I'm not quite sure what that's totally referring to. So I might throw to Daniel just to clarify the question, and then I can probably answer it.
Yeah. So hi, Joshua. Thanks for that.
No worries at all.
So I'm actually a bushfire planning consultant. I'll just put that out there. So
Awesome.
very heavily on looking at Victorian planning provisions and vegetation management requirements, all that sort of thing, your tables 53.02 and your table 6 and all that sort of bizzo. But this question in relation to this stuff, knowing that I go through a lot of planning stuff, public land, which is predominantly usually roadsides, etc., they're typically managed by councils and or Vic roads, etc. And I just took a note at the first, basically your intro where you said the section 42 in the CFA Act talks about we are not land managers. We'll only act when the landholder will request that an area be burnt. Yep. So my question is, private landowners really have to engage through their councils really as a group in a localized context to try and get these things going so the CFA helps participate, or does it go directly through proposition through the JFMP, etc.?
Yep. Yep, I understand a bit more there. Yes and no, Daniel. I think there's multiple avenues in that. So yes, in terms of this gets really strange, but in public land, we're mostly talking about the public land forestry estate. So I was a bit unsure of the question, but yeah. So obviously, roadsides are managed by a particular road authority, whether that's Vic roads and councils, and they have authority. They effectively own that land. You can't do things on their land without their approval. Same way I can't walk into your house and break down a wall or something. So we need their approval and their consent to do things. That's what Section 42 of the CFA Act refers to. So it says that they need to request it, or we need their consent to be able to do things. In terms of, I'm not so sure about a community engagement plan per se, but if people want to advocate on getting roadsides burned, obviously that involves getting landholders to consent to doing that, and whether that's council or Vic roads or or forest fire or DECA as a public land manager in terms of the public land estate. That's obviously a part of it. You can come talk to CFA about that, and we can then go to the land manager and have that conversation with them. So a lot of the ecological burning that we do in the Wimmera has gone through that process. So land care groups have brought that to me, and then I've taken it to the council or something to have a conversation about. So I think, yeah, all roads lead to Rome to some extent, but I do highly encourage having conversations with both CFA and council if you're advocating to get burns done, because we're the ones that are going to do it at the end of the day. Yeah, until we can build capacity elsewhere.
Debbie, you have your hand up, a proper hand up this time.
Yes, I realised my protolepis always hides my hand. So I took away my protolepis. I want to ask a specific question early on. You talked about the Wimmera and you burnt some sites that had been long unburnt. How long unburnt were they? And some of these, the buds still came up. So orchids, I'm assuming, lilies. I'm confused. I would just really want to know that. The question.
It's a great question, Debbie, and unfortunately records are not that good. So it's hard to know exactly when the last burn would have occurred. We mostly rely on sort of local knowledge to get that information. So, for example, one of the burns in question was Rapanyip, was an old disused rail line outside of Rapanyip, which we had really good regeneration in. And I think you might have been included on an email where I sent some photos through of that one. According to the local group officer, that hadn't been burnt for 40+ years. He remembers it being burnt when he was a child, and that's it. So, he remembers it being burnt as a young CFA member. So 40+ years potentially. So it's not.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, and
that's really interesting because we don't know. We actually just do not know how long some of these intertussock, plants, orchids, buds will actually survive, or even the seed, whether the seed was there and it actually did that. And I was going to say a few more comments. Grasslands, if we burnt all grasslands as they're ecologically supposed to be, all of them would be managed properly as fire breaks and retardants for absolutely everything. So I don't see where you can say some places are more important than others. They're all important, especially the roadsides. And also another comment I found too when I did my research, that mowing was as good, it's not significantly different than a control. It's as simple as that. Burning, significantly different. In regards to flowering for pimelia, producing seeds, mowing and a control was exactly the same, pretty much. So exactly what you found, which was really interesting. And also the other thing I think a burning does, removes all the nutrients. I think that's, you talked about other chemical cues and things, but it gets rid of all that biomass. And so you have less nutrients on the ground to soak in, sort of thing. Whereas mowing leaves all that thatch. I think I
did mention nutrients, and that was part of my hypothesis. I never really ended up doing any direct testing on that one, but that was kind of my thinking too, is that sometimes there was studies done as a part of other PhDs where they looked at nitrification and stuff of urban grasslands and noted that resulted in a decline in forb diversity. And I was thinking a bit about kind of like what you were saying around whether mowing sort of leaves it there and you would get an increase in nutrients, which then reduces forb diversity. Fortunately, I kind of ran out of time to sort of dig into that in any detail, but I suspect that's another part of it. I suspect another part of that too is also when you burn it, you get increased moisture, seed soil contact, and increased moisture into the soils as a result of them not getting run off. So I think increased moisture is probably a part of it as well. But yeah, that's a good note. And yeah, I totally agree on the time since fire thing. It's there's a lot of, I think, talk around we need to burn every year or every second year to maintain native grasslands. I'm not totally convinced by it. I think weed management's probably a big reason why we probably don't always get that really good flush of diversity when sites have gone really long unburnt. But if we could couple that with a bit of active direct seeding and a bit of more weed management, would we get it? I don't know. So yeah, all interesting questions. Noting the Wimmera is a lot drier than other areas, so that could be
so maybe you wonder whether those tubers hang on longer. That's the other thing. Like, do they? You just don't know. Definitely more resources. I'm shocked that we don't have more resources with burning over time, considering global warming, and it's just going to burn more anyway. And we, as you said, you get no rest now. It's very difficult to get burns done because there is not enough people doing the burns. I thought cultural burning was supposed to step up and take over and help, but is it? Is there any help there?
There is. There's many reasons why maybe that hasn't gone, maybe increased as much as we would have hoped. I mean, traditional owners do a lot of burning in this part of the world, but there's, I'm not going to comment too much on that. I think that's not for me to comment on. But
I think it'd be a shame. It's a shame it's not happened more, and it really should be supported and be more active, because that is what we have to do. As you said, the cool burning, which is what's supposed to happen over time. Right, I'll stop talking.
We probably need another talk on fuel management and just
definitely
various ways we can do it. David Unwin, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Hi, thanks Josh for the talk. It's really informative, and I see Debbie's here from a previous one on where she talked about pimelia, which was interesting too. A couple of things that you've said there that I sort of have a couple of questions on. So the first one, I'll just touch on, I read a paper a little while ago, would be a few years ago, about there's a nutrient pulse after a burn, but then it depletes within about 3 months. And that's obviously from the ash on the ground and possibly gets washed away when there's a rain or gets taken up by new seeds germinating or fungi. So I wouldn't say from I wouldn't say it would be completely devoid of nutrients following a burn. I think that there is a lot of unlocked nutrients that disappear fairly quickly, from what I've read anyway. But the question that I had was, you talked about green breaks, and in my land care group, I frequently come across people that aren't in the land care group but are in the community that say, oh, agapanthus are great because they're a green break for a grass fire, and say get rid of them because they're a weed. But what can we replace them with? You said Thermida is a really good green break. What other sorts of things could we use as a green break on a fairly grassy area?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, thanks for asking that one. Yeah, just I mean, I don't think anyone's implying that fire would take away all nutrients. There needs to be some sort of nutrients for plant growth to occur. But yeah, I think you're right. You do get a bit of an initial sort of peak and then a decline. In terms of green breaks, agapanthus. God, I've spent so much time digging out agapanthus that I'm now scarred by the term. But yes, in terms of other species, the CFA does have a great resource on that, which is called the Firewise Plant Selection Key. But I think Thermida is a great green break. It's not perfect. I mean, fire will still spread through it, but if you maintain it in a discontinuous state, it's pretty green over summer, unless it's really dry, and the fire intensity will drop as soon as it gets into it. So that's why it's a good green break. Other things like pig face and other sort of succulent type native plants are quite effective green breaks as well. So there's a few different species you could try, but I would encourage you to get onto the Firewise plant list on the CFA website, because there's some good resources in there for doing green breaks.
Red leg grass is another species that's quite
spot
good
on.
too.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, red leg grass is quite similar. Yeah.
All those summer growing ones. Amy Jackson's got a comment in here that I just like. It's a comment, not a question, but great presentation. I think that's a great point about the cool burning and late season burning, late autumn, winter, being really beneficial for grasslands, if not for fuel reduction. In some cases, I think burn plans were being enacted because the percentage burn cover target was set too high. So the grassland missed out, when instead the target should be reduced.
It's a great comment. Yeah. Sorry, Adrian, I just cut you off.
No, please.
Oh, it's a great comment, and I'm being recorded, so I won't say too much. But I've been very frequently having this conversation with my colleagues in multiple departments around this. We did very recently do some burning where this came up quite a number of times, because the objective, I think, was 80 to 90% burn, and whether that's always desirable, even from a fire risk point of view, is something we should ask ourselves. But yes, it is something that I think I think it's a great point, because we do often have that conversation as to, we're not going to go burn it in autumn or winter because we're not going to meet our objective. Well, either your objective's wrong, or the way that you're doing this isn't totally right. And if we go back, and I'm not sharing my screen, and I won't reshare it, but if we start to talk about that discontinuity, sorry, I'm stuttering, in grasslands as a way of reducing fire risk and spread, you don't need 100% coverage for that to occur, right? You just need to break up the continuity. So cool burning can be effective in that regards. How effective? I don't know. We need to do more of it and see how it interacts with running grass fires to get a sense of that. But that would be my idea around how we can actually, I mean, in terms of fuel loads, fuel loads is not so much of a concept in grassland. It's more about fuel continuity in grass heights and stuff around radiant heat and flame heights and suppressibility, and then spread. So it's a great point. We probably get too focused on trying to remove all the fuels.
So Lee Heenan, speaking of cool burns, asks, says that she'd be keen to learn more about land care groups doing cool burns. So what avenues are there for that sort of learning?
Well, she can contact her local VMO, which is myself. Yes, Lynn. I think we've spoken about that a little bit, but I think we've done some work on trying to get some training resources for land care groups. We're still working on that grant, I believe, and do some training with land care groups, starting that a little bit with my land care group in Horsham, but funding to actually get proper training materials and stuff is a limiting factor. But yeah, I think Lynn and I, Lynn, we've had conversations about the Skipton Common and some of those roadsides around Stoneleigh and stuff, and I think those are great opportunities for your local land care groups to get out there and do a bit of training. Some of those really cool burns we've done on the Mount William Road with yourself and your brigade, like that. That would be a great learning opportunity for a local land care group.
Other questions, people? Hands up, just shout out. Vanessa, you had one before. You put your hand back down again.
There's a few more questions in the chat. Oh, sorry, I
Yes.
just interrupted.
Yeah, I did. Don't worry about it. Stuff is already sort of been covered, so no need.
Okay.
Thank you.
Michael Robinson asks if there's any research on the biochemical effects of ecological burns compared to hot burns. Is it only carbon, or are there other nutrient benefits? Well, we've sort of talked about that a little bit, and it's probably a giant conversation we can't completely cover. But anything you'd like to say about the consequences of cool versus hot?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's always as clear cut with cool versus hot, but there was a study done on nutrients and moisture retention with no fire compared to a department prescribed burn compared to a cultural burn, which was done at a lot lower intensities, and it compared the three, and basically it showed the prescribed burn was better than no burn, and the cultural burn was better than them both, which I kind of read that as, in terms of intensity, as lower intensity stuff is probably going to be better for nutrient retention and moisture retention. But that's a really, really complex space. Like we could go down a whole rabbit hole on that conversation alone, I think. But yeah, probably needs more research, to be honest.
Yeah, and a whole talk. Ruth Cannon, you have your hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm sitting in the dark, but I just have a quick question on the back of the person who was asking about land care doing burns. I'm still a little confused as to like how much qualification you need to do a burn, as it say, for example, if you are a private landholder, so you've got the landholder permission out the way. If you get your council permit and you do your notifications to like emergency management, do you need any formal qualifications to do a burn, considering, for example, that you don't to do like a stockpile burn or something like that?
No, you don't need qualifications to do a burn. However, burning is not an activity without considerable risk. The fire that I had in my local community on Sunday was from an escaped burn, which caused quite considerable impact. So you don't need formal qualifications to do a burn, but I think part of what I'm trying to do is build that training and capacity just to increase awareness among people. So yeah, it's not that you need formal qualifications, it's that we really just need to increase that training and awareness for people if they're going to be going out and burning off safely. CFA attends many fires, and I've attended many in my time as a volunteer firefighter of burns gone wrong.
Yeah,
that's
due to
a lack of
know.
awareness and training. Yeah.
So it's more best practice than actually, because I think a lot of people think that you're just not allowed to do it, but obviously it's good that that is kind of somewhat preventing people going rogue. But yeah, it's good to know that you can. There are ways to learn that, and it's not necessarily a bureaucratic restriction.
Yeah, spot on. That's right.
Can I quickly ask about the planned burn task force, Joshua? It's like,
sure.
Is that the group that's sort of like the flying squad that Melbourne volunteers who go out to visit other places get called out to sort of help in the burning? I mean, yeah.
Not all Melbourne. Most of the task force members are just local volunteers in their area. We do have quite a few from Melbourne that come out, like a lot of the sort of outer metro where they don't get a lot of exposure to fight the actual bush and grass fires, so they come out on burns for training purposes, and then when they get deployed out as part of a strike team to an actual bushfire, they've got a bit more awareness. I think that is a hugely untapped market, though, Melbourne and places like that, for many reasons, not just planned burning. I think you mentioned the flying squad. I think we're limiting ourselves if we're limiting ourselves only to country area of Victoria. So I'm hoping with time that'll change, but Planned Burn Task Force is not limited to just Melbourne people. It's the whole state can be a part of it.
Yeah. Okay, Daniel, you have another question.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe completing the circle, I'm not sure. But can I ask, was there any consideration in your study for the role of native animal activity like dung deposits or digging in supporting microbiota transfer, boosting biodiversity outcomes in relation to also the versus the two element argument, fire versus just mowing, and maybe some lateral ideas in relation to roadside protected pathways for native species movement to also maybe support some of that stuff. So I get a feeling sometimes when I listen to some of the fire sticks movements in New South Wales and what they're doing with their native stuff and their cool burning, that's also particularly part of the picture in their ecological cycle.
So my PhD didn't look at it. There was another PhD student working on native animal diggings in Canberra. I think she was a few years ahead of me, but so some of her studies got published while I was working, and there's a lot of debate around why fire cue germination has evolved in plants in the first place. And one of the things that's proposed is that was actually it's a con adaptation to response to microbial action as a result of mammal diggings, which is then allowed these species to respond better to fire as it became more common in the landscape. You know, the evolutionary biologists will have a field day debating that forever. It's impossible to prove one way or the other. But there was studies done on, I can't remember the name of the reserve in Canberra, where they were looking at betong diggings, and they were looking at Wimmera, which is early Nancy, and it was showing that early Nancy's were germinating more with betongs diggings than without, and the betong restoration was helping that process. So I think all these things kind of come together, and it talks to those physiochemical cues. So basically the chemical in smoke that promotes germination is carotenoid, or a group of chemicals known as carotenoids and ethylene. And basically there's some evidence of diggings of mammals can actually promote those same chemicals through microbial action. So these things are probably one and the same to some extent. But yeah, we could spend all day debating the chemistries and the evolution. That's a whole nother topic. But yeah, I think both of those things are probably important. Whether it's necessarily, whether it's a missing picture per se in Victorian grasslands to the extent that it was in Canberra, I'm not sure. But I suspect fire probably is more importantly the thing that's gone missing in Victorian grasslands.
Fascinating. David Unwin, perhaps last question. Where I'm conscious we're heading towards 8 o'clock.
Sure, thanks. Just keeping that circle rolling. Just back on the question about if landholders or landcare groups were getting involved in doing burning, if something were to get out of control where CFA did need to respond, what's the consequence? Is there a call out fee? Is there prosecution? Is there a fine? You know, I'm trying to understand, like, if there's no qualification, where does the line get drawn as to what's just we need a bit of help to get this back under control versus whoops, it's gotten away from us?
So there's a whole other talk in of itself, but there's many different definitions. There's many definitions of escaped. So it depends. So if you're within the fire danger period and you lose a burn, there are very, very hefty penalties associated with that, including potentially 24 months imprisonment or 12 months imprisonment, sorry. That's obviously the extreme end of a prosecution. Outside of the fire danger period, you could be charged under the Summary Offences Act, which can carry a fine and various things. However, in saying all of that, sometimes cooler heads prevail and sometimes accidents just happen. And as a CFA volunteer or as an incident controller for a fire, for example, I was incident controller for an escaped burn in my town on the weekend, as I've already mentioned. It's really up to you whether you want to get the police involved and have that person charged. And you can use your judgment and your experience to make a call as to whether that person had done this maliciously or whether they hadn't. I have had people charged for escape burns before because they were done maliciously. I've also let people off with a warning. I had a conversation with them about how they could safely do this next time, which is what I did on the weekend, by the way. So that often gets left to CFA volunteers to make some judgment calls about whether they if they think this needs to be taken up further or not, or CFA staff and volunteers. Obviously, if you light a burn on public land and something goes wrong, that's a whole different ballgame. If you light a burn on a roadside, for example, without permission, that is technically arson because you have just lit a burn on land that you did not have consent to light that on. So that's, and I've had that conversation with a number of people over the years who have gone out and sort of snuck out and done burns without approvals. That's technically arson, which is a massive penalty for doing that. Yes.
So effectively what you're
Apologies,
saying is,
I kind of lost track of my thought.
What I'm hearing is do a lot of planning beforehand and engage with the CFA, engage with the landholder, obviously as the first point, but do a lot of the planning, keep people informed, and don't do it in the fire danger period, and get people's involvement and consent before, even from the CFA, before going ahead with it.
Yes, that's a perfect answer, I think. Yeah, if you can, the more engagement you have with your local CFA captains and those officers that I talked about, the better. And, you know, if you're doing cool burning, the chances of that getting out is extremely low. So obviously making sure that you're burning that at a really low intensity. And also I'll just note that if there's damage to structures and things, that's a whole different ballgame again. But if you're doing cool burning, the chances of that happening are extremely low. But I do encourage you to, yeah, have a chat with your local CFA, including your veg management officer, to learn about burning off safely seminars and stuff like that we run.
Great.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joshua. Unless anyone's got any screaming questions left, let's wind this up and thank Joshua very much for the depth of his knowledge and his ability to communicate it. And yes, hopefully we'll see you back here again for yet another Grassy Talk at some point. It's who knows. It's thank you very much, Joshua. That was brilliant.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Adrian.